The 300 grand Copcast, the latest from Podnews.net, with critically acclaimed, highly addictive CBC podcasts. In Toronto, in Canada, the police have made 24 Shades of Blue, a podcast giving the Toronto community a behind-the-scenes view of police activities. A CBC investigation has discovered that the interview show, produced by Obie and Axe, North America's leading podcast production firm, has cost more than $330,000 so far in a sole source contract. That money hasn't gone on hosting either. The show's on Spotify's free podcast host, Anchor. Edison Podcast Metrics has released its latest ranker of the most listened to podcasts in the US. The data now covers the last 6 months of listening instead of a whole year and includes Americans aged 13 plus. It was 18 plus before. The top 4, though, is unchanged, and Joe Rogan is still number 1 for podcasts. What is one of the most developed podcast markets in all of East and Southeast Asia? It's podcasting in Thailand, where they like learning new things, but also love horror. Our initial look at podcast markets across East and Southeast Asia is now complete. We'll start diving deeper into each country in the coming months. Spotify has a new investor. San Francisco-based Value Act Capital Management is reported to be an activist investor, keen to see Spotify cut costs. The level of investment isn't yet clear. YouTube's head of podcasting, Kai Chuck, is to speak at next week's Hot Pod Summit in Brooklyn in the US. Ariel Shapiro will be doing a short interview with Chuck about how YouTube plans to leverage its position as the top streamer of podcasts, they say. YouTube took part in a number of large events last year but didn't make any announcements, and features in a leaked document shown to publishers last March have yet to materialize. Live One, the owner of Podcast One, released a quarterly financial report. Ad revenue grew by 3% to $26.1 million in the 9 months ending December the 31st. Podcast One is the bulk of this revenue, and the company will spin out Podcast One before the end of March. Podcast One's website has also added games hosted by some of its podcast hosts. Listeners can win exciting rewards. The Women in Podcast Network is celebrating more than 9,000 members across social media. The network has its own podcast, the Women in Podcasting Show, which shares insightful stories and experiences from women podcasters. At Large has added the Podco Network to its portfolio. The LA-based company produces a number of rewatch shows hosted by stars from Disney and Nickelodeon. The Australian podcast ranker for January was released. SCA's Listener claims number 1, while ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia also claims number 1. SiriusXM, represented by Listener, reached number 2 in the publisher list despite making no shows in the country. And thank you to Fireside for becoming our latest supporter. Fireside offers powerful podcast hosting and analytics by podcasters for podcasters since 2016, and we're grateful for their support. It enables us to take on more projects like our restoration of the Trade Secrets feed. You too can support us at podnews.net/support. And in podcast news, City of Tents Veterans Row is new today from KCRW, taking us back to the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic when a large homeless encampment sprang up beside the Veterans Affairs campus in Los Angeles. The Lost Soviet tells the fascinating story of a cosmonaut who was stranded in space for 313 days after the Soviet Union collapsed. The highly produced narrative podcast is produced by Kaleidoscope and iHeart Podcasts. Mugshots is a brand new show from the acclaimed and dogged journalist Michael Crick, known to UK television viewers of Newsnight, BBC News and Channel 4. The show looks closely at some of the individuals who are shaping our world. Vladimir Putin is to come, but he starts with Paul Dacre, the former editor of the Daily Mail, which claims it's a newspaper. It's produced by Podmasters. And You Didn't See Nothing launches today from USG Audio and the Invisible Institute. It's a 7-part series investigating a race-related attack in 1997 in the south side of Chicago. It's hosted by someone who started to investigate the crime for a newspaper before serving a 10-year prison sentence. This podcast is sponsored by CBC Podcasts. The Africas versus America is available in your favorite podcast app and chronicles the Black Liberation Organization MOVE. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.